So this is actually the Nando cut video that I was planning to start with, because this was something that I wanted to do, but then the Kiki Palmer thing came up and that really got my attention. And I tried to record this before and I just didn't love the one that I had, and then I kept getting caught up. So I want to do this now because I want to revisit a casting choice from one of my recent-ish videos. It's from 2 months ago. It feels like it's from 5 years ago because that's just how things work time-wise. But yeah, it's the video that I made fan casting the X-Men, what I called the next generation of X-Men. I would say this class was the last couple of absolute A-listers that have been introduced in the X-Men. Like Bishop and Gambit were introduced in the early 90s. There's other characters like, you know, Laura, X-23, something like that are pretty high tier. But I think there's something to staying power. Like if you're around for like 30 years, that kind of makes you an A-lister. Anyway, what I'm saying is I made this video. I cast a bunch of guys. And one particular stood out in comments that I read that were all, well, not all. I didn't read every single one of them, but the ones that I saw were pretty like normal. In general, I feel like the comments on my videos are usually pretty friendly and agreeable, which is cool. But I got a bunch of comments on this fan casting Next Generation of X-Men video saying that people didn't like my choice for Bishop specifically because he was not Indigenous Australian. I didn't really think too much through it. And honestly, by that point in the video, I was like, because it was Bishop and then Psylocke, and I had put so much energy into figuring out the Psylocke thing and like just getting all that down. I don't want to say I rushed Bishop, but I do think like he was, out of everybody, probably the guy I spent the least amount of time on, and possibly also because, like I said in the video, he's not my favorite. But it all comes from like a misconception that I made in the background of the character. I don't know what we 100% know and what we think we know, right? There's some things about Bishop's background that we think we know, right? Like it seems like he might be related to Storm because there's a woman who I believe is his grandmother who has white hair and, you know, black skin and seems to know a lot about the X-Men. And I believe when she told Bishop stories about the X-Men, you could see what he was thinking, and he got a bunch of them wrong. Or like you know, he's like kind of didn't quite pick up on exactly what Nightcrawler looked like. He got like blue and tail or something, but he got Storm dead on. So it's like, hey, Storm was very clear about how Storm looked, and like he was like, oh, she looks like, yeah, it looks like my grandma's because she's Storm. So there's some speculation that Storm's related to him. There's also speculation that Monet St. Croix is related to him. They have a history where it seems like he's noticed her in moments and been like, you're my mom, or just said like, you look like my mom or something like that. And when that happens with the time traveler, it's like, oh, okay, it's because she's his mom, or you know, that's not a coincidence that you see in comics a lot. So you got those two, and those are like your maybes. And so Storm is part African and part American. I forget why I thought she was British. I don't know where I got that from. And then Monet, Algerian, there you go, born in Bosnia. So those two characters, right, maybe related to Bishop. And then you've got Gateway, who I'm not sure if he was introduced after Fall of the Mutants, but when the mutants, like the main X-Men, ended up in Australia for a little bit, they met him there. Then he is like an older man who's he's like mysterious. He doesn't talk. He has teleporting powers, and he is Indigenous Australian. And we know he's related to Bishop. I believe Bishop and him have talked. I want to say this was in Uncanny X-Men or Extreme X-Men. Bishop and him talking. He's like, I'm your grandfather. Something. Bishop has that information. But so that's it. Those are the members, the X-Men, the known X-Men that we know or think are related to Bishop. We know his parents, at least one of them, is Indigenous Australian. And I think part of the problem here, and I've explained this all just because I want to set the ground there. Part of the problem is I didn't recognize the difference between Indigenous Australian and just Australian. So when I said Eka Darville was Australian, it would be like me saying John Hamm would be a good Thunderbird because he is also American, much like Thunderbird. And it's like, well, kind of, technically, but not the same. It's different. So that's what this was. And like, I apologize. I was wrong about that. I had missed that in his biography. Like, I'd read it and gone like, oh, Australian. Okay, that's good to know. Like I said, part of it comes to me not being Bishop's biggest fan. Part of it comes to me being raised with the cartoons and kind of with like a passing knowledge of Bishop. It never really came up. So you kind of just filled in the blanks. But it's important because A, I didn't bring it up, so I need to. And then B, there are Indigenous Australian actors. And so when I cast Trevante Rhodes, I believe, for Bishop, it felt like, well, what, you left all these guys out. And we talked about representation. We talk about it a lot when we're talking about Magneto and plenty of other characters. But like, he was the first well, I guess it was the first time. I guess Ben Grimm was the first time it really came up. And it was like, the character hasn't been represented this way. They should be, because it's technically part of their deal. And especially with Indigenous Australians, because it is like, there's a film industry there. And there are plenty of actors that seem like they would, I would bet, would be like psyched for this. So I wanted to revisit the casting of Bishop and look at some other actors. However, here's the tricky part. And this is really like, this is why I think it's so hard. Bishop is Indigenous Australian, at least half, like I said. The other half up for grabs. Not like up for grabs, but we don't know. And this isn't to say that I think if it was introduced later, that means it doesn't count or anything like that. But I've seen interviews about this kind of recently, because there were not any black male mutants. There was obviously Storm, but it's a woman. They had male readers, and the edict came down from editorial that was, we need a character that our black American readers can associate themselves with, that they can feel represented by. I guess what I'm saying is, this is tricky because you want an Indigenous Australian actor. Ideally, that would be great. It would be good representation, and it would be true to the comic. So you definitely want to represent him properly. The tough part is, one of the most consistent pieces of casting I did see was Method Man of the Wu-Tang Clan, who does seem like he really wants to play Bishop. And he's done like photo shoots, and it looks great. Like, it's put a lot of work into it. Seems to be a big fan of the character. And what I'm willing to bet is he grew up with that character like a lot of us did. Like, just assumed he was an African-American man from the future, but like, that was what they were going for, probably because of the voice actors that they used to portray him, and probably just because it doesn't come up too often in the comics. It does come up, like, you can find it, but it's not like, you know, say Gambit, where from minute one you're like, oh, this guy's Cajun, I get it. It's something you could miss. And I guess I don't blame people in that situation for seeing Bishop and kind of going, oh yeah, just like me, great, and feeling represented by Bishop. I guess what I'm saying is, we're looking at the representation of Bishop as a concern for casting, which I think is valid, but it does also bring up, we're back into colorism like we were with Storm, where we're like, this character has almost always been portrayed with almost the exact same skin tone as Storm. Especially early on, that was what Bishop looked like. And if we're saying, which I think we were for Storm, that if he is dark-skinned on the page, he should be in real life, because that is something that colorism is a big problem when it comes to representation in Hollywood, and was with Storm. Should Bishop also be part of that? So like, are we not just looking for an Indigenous Australian actor, but a dark-skinned Indigenous Australian actor? Because then it gets really tricky. Because there are a couple of Indigenous Australian actors who I think are solid. Like Mark Cole-Smith, I think is the one that probably came up the most. I did get a couple of like people that were recommending people. And this guy, he's been in the business for a while. He's been in a lot of shows. The first thing that came up when I IMDb'd him was some show he's in where he seems to be a police officer or some cop. And he's got A, big biceps, and B, a gun. And I'm like, well, that is like Bishop thing 1 and thing 2. So off to an incredible start. And it's not up to me to determine if he is dark enough skin to play Bishop. I don't think a fully white, like if you had my skin tone and you were Indigenous Australian, I think you probably still can't play Bishop, right? I think there's an element that he has to be darker than this. But what's the level? What's the bar? I don't know. There's other actors there's one that's a little bit older who I don't like quite as much, who also does like action movies. And I know I had his name. Like, I had this written down maybe on a piece of paper, but I can't find it anymore. I looked and looked and looked. And there's not a ton of Indigenous Australian actors, so like, how did I lose him? But there was another guy who's older, who's been in something with Mark Wahlberg. I cannot remember his name. He also had the Bishop look. He also, like, he's a little older, so he's like 50, but like Bishop can be 50. He's from the future. But the problem with that is, I don't remember. I feel like he was also on the lighter skin side, so it's like, oh, maybe. There was one actor who stood out as both Indigenous Australian and dark-skinned, like, black man, and that was by Kali Ganambar, I believe is the actor's name. And he was in a movie called The Nightingale, which I watched. You can watch it on Netflix, in America, at least. So this guy fits the profile. I think he's tall, too, which is good. I feel like Bishop should be pretty tall. The tricky thing with him is he's only been in, like, 2 things, and in neither of them has he played, like, a Bishop type. So he doesn't have a ton of experience. I'd need to like see one more thing from him, I feel like, and I'd be like, oh, he can do it. I'd love to see him in something more modern. And I don't know if he's going to keep acting. I've read about this guy a little bit. He was a dancer, I believe, and they've kind of discovered him. First movie was in 2018. Second movie was in 2020. I'm sure COVID had something to do with why he hasn't put out anything recently. Or like maybe he's done. Maybe he doesn't want to do acting anymore. I don't know. But like I think he could probably do it. So him and Mark Cole Smith are like the two. Baikali, I think, is like a 100% definitely dark-skinned enough for everybody to be happy. Mark Cole Smith, maybe. I do think if everything else being equal, he's probably who I would pick. Again, just because he's got more experience in the business and he seems like he knows what he's doing. And that's always something that I think about when I'm casting big franchise players. There is another option, though, if we want something that's just going to make like a complete left turn. You would not expect this, but also kind of works. Let's think about representation in terms of the X-Men. Besides Gateway and Bishop, obviously you have a sister Shard. You also have a character named Manifold, who definitely knows Gateway. I can't remember if he's related to Gateway. It doesn't matter. But he is another X-Man, more recent. But he had some stuff to do in a recent Avengers run, and he was in the Sword series. So like he's a player. So there are 3 Indigenous Australian X-Men. But there are no Filipino X-Men. There's very few Filipino comic characters in general, which I always thought was weird. Like, I don't know what percentage of the population they are or anything like that, but you just figure there'd be some. There's plenty of Filipino comic book professionals, artists, writers. In fact, the artist that came up with Bishop, that designed Bishop, is Filipino himself. And he planned to make Bishop Filipino, but they told him no. They said they wanted a black man, like I said, to represent the black readers at the time. But if this guy got his way, Bishop would have been Filipino. And that's why on one of the trading cards, I believe, it says that he is. And that's just like a remnant of, or like maybe like an Easter egg to that fact. But if they wanted to do something completely different, you could get a Filipino, dark-skinned Filipino actor to play Bishop. And that would also kind of be true to the comic. And that would also really help with representation. Again, I'm not saying I think this is a good idea or what they should do. When I was looking up Bishop's history and what race is Bishop and all that stuff, this did come up as like he was originally supposed to be Filipino according to the creator of Bishop, one of Bishop's creators, and they just didn't let him. This is all from bleedingcool.com. As for changing his racial identity, Portasio stated that X-Men editor and current DCEIC Bob Harris asked Portasio if Bishop could be black, as there were so many African-American kids sending in X-Men fan mail, and he wanted a hero who could inspire those young readers. Will Portasio said, understanding as a minority, I couldn't say no. I was already operating in the mood of just give it up, right? There's always another time. I'm not going to try to pronounce all of these words. It will make me look stupid. But you guys can read it and you can get the vibe of what he's saying, which is basically, he was like, as a minority myself, what am I going to do? Say no? I just gave it up. And I'm like, we'll get another one eventually. And they never did. There's not been a Filipino X-Men. So I'm not saying that Bishop should be Filipino exclusively for that reason, but it is like, that's an option too. It's a weird option. Again, I just want to make sure nobody's happy with this. However, I did find an actor for this because I was like, is there a guy? There's an actor named Charles Michael Davis, who is on a TV show named The Originals. He's also in a show called Younger. And I believe I want to say still on Grey's Anatomy. Is Grey's Anatomy still going? Oh my God. Is it? No. He was on Grey's Anatomy for a little bit. But like, it's on NCIS New Orleans. Like, this guy works in the American film industry, television industry, I guess mostly. And this actor is half Filipino and half African American. And he plays action heroes, things like that. So I think Mark Cole Smith is probably the safest bet here. If we wanted to take a chance, by Kali Ganenbar, also probably able to do it. And then if we wanted to pick someone that just didn't seem like what you'd expect, but also kind of is connected to Bishop in a weird way, Charles Michael Davis, also an option. Those are 3 Bishops that I think, looking back, are better than Trevante Rhodes. Not better actors, but better fits for the role. I do think Trevante Rhodes will get the job. I think he is probably just what they'll end up picking. Although, who knows when they'll ever make these X-Men movies, so we could all be dead. It could be a very long time, but I think if we're thinking about representation, those 3 guys, better options. Also, not sure if this wasn't clear, I do think that Damian Wayne should be played by a kid who is some mix of white and Chinese and Arab Like that's just what they should do. I don't think that kid exists now. I don't think we'll get a movie with Damian Wayne for 10 years. I don't think the kid that should be playing Damian Wayne is yet born. So it's impossible to cast for that reason, and also just impossible to cast because I could not find a 10-year-old actor that was that. But yeah, they should pick the one who's the right background to match Damian in the comics. Again, thank you everybody for subscribing to this channel, The Nando Cut. Obviously, Nando V Movies. If you've never seen me there, that would make this video very confusing. Usually these will probably be kind of separate, but please let me know if there's anything you want me to talk, any things that like are current events or things that you want me to expound upon in other videos that I haven't made super clear, or just other follow-up questions, because that's what this is for. Listen to my podcast, all that great stuff. I will see you guys very soon for more videos, and yeah, stay safe everybody. Goodbye.